So which single 40k army is the one to beat right now? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd take a look through the performance of the top armies in the game, and rather than focusing on every single faction in Warhammer 40k as we often do in these videos, just focus on the absolute top of the tree this time, and looking at the armies and factions that are best tearing up the meta. I thought it might be interesting to do one of these videos now we've had Orcs, Thousand Sons and Grey Knights released, and just focus on the tournament results and stats that have come out ever since those new books have dropped. At the moment I'd argue that there is a fairly clear first and second place, so if you want to make any predictions for yourself as to what they are, then go ahead now. In any case, first we'll talk through all of the close contenders for the top spots, then go over the top two, and talk about why the armies are doing quite so well at the moment. So first up, let's talk through the armies that are all performing really quite solidly, and certainly give you a good chance of placing highly in a top event. For the comparisons, I've been using their win rate and the number of top 4s they've achieved in grand tournaments or majors, starting from a week after the Grey Knights and Thousand Sons books went on sale, so hopefully at least most of those events would be featuring the new rules for those armies. The data comes from Warhammer 40k Stats Center. I'll put a link in the video description below. Thoroughly recommend checking them out. It gives some really good insights into what's doing well. In any case, first up we have the Death Guard, a 51% win rate, and 5 armies in the top 4s over the last few weeks. Still very much a solid army to overcome, and well capable of holding their own against the other top dogs. Death Guard don't exactly have the biggest and widest unit diversity. The vast majority of top lists will take a fair amount of Plague Burst Crawlers, Terminators, Poxwalkers, and also the Relic Contemptor Dreadnoughts with the Volkite Culverins. Back those all up with a few powerful support characters, perhaps a Lord and a Psyker, a Tallyman and the Gentleman with the Plague Sprayer, and you've got a list that's usually going to be a challenge to overcome, just from the sheer amount of durability that you have, and some pretty hefty damage dealing when you need it. Perhaps Mortarion himself is being played a little bit less than before. I feel like a lot of the more recently released armies do quite like having one enormous target to plug all of their damage into, and his psychic powers aren't particularly helped out by some of the new armies. Still though, with a win rate of over 50%, they're still a solid threat on the other side of the table. Next up we come to the Adeptus Sororitas, a 54% win rate and 5 top 4 placings as well. I'd argue perhaps the sisters didn't make as much of a hit as Admech or Drukhari when they came out, despite releasing it around about the same time. The sisters really do have quite a lot of tricks in their arsenal. Really helpful miracle dice to lock in charges or get the maximum damage through when you need it. Interesting options for psychic defense, including denying powers on a 5+ automatically, and a whole host of really powerful strong damage set pieces, including Retributors, Repentia, and the Dominions with the Stormbolters. A lot of people seem to be going for mixed lists these days, taking a Bloody Rose detachment for their melee units and combining that with a more shooting orientated one, maybe Ebon Chalice, Argent Shroud, or perhaps Valorous Heart. Morven Val, Celestine, or both often make appearances in lists as well, backed up by a core of Sacrosants who have the power to stop them from being targeted by enemy fire all game, provided those Sacrosants can hide. With their slightly more fragile defensive stats, I'd argue Sisters are maybe a touch harder to play than some of the other armies, but have a lot of seriously strong options, both for winning the damage dealing game and also swoopy about winning the mission and secondaries. Next up we have one of the new kids on the block with the Grey Knights. They're already sitting at a 55% win rate, even if it hasn't actually materialised into all that many good tournament placings yet. I feel like not having been out quite that long, Grey Knights might still be in their early adoption phase, people getting armies together and trying to figure out what sort of combos they want to throw down. It seems like the Rapier's Brotherhood seems to be the most popular one. They can combine with a Chaplain with Words of Power for just some absolutely silly damage out of their Strike Marines, and combine those guys with a few Dread Knights and Interceptors, lightly Caldor Drago and a tooled up Grandmaster in a Nemesis Dread Knight, and you've got a list that puts out some incredibly hefty damage in psychic shooting, then in combat, all in turn. Having pretty much the ultimate psychic defense in a whole ton of Deny the Witch with +1 to it certainly doesn't seem to be a particularly bad thing in the meta either, and could certainly give Psycho-reliant armies quite a lot of problems. It's going to be interesting to see if they do turn into one of the major threats of 9th, or whether they're just an army that people are learning to deal with, that perhaps have a fairly set playstyle and how you might beat them. Next up, and maybe not seeming quite as hot as the Grey Knights right out of the gate, are the Thousand Sons. They're sitting on a 50% win rate with just the 2 top 4 finishes, and I'd argue that there may be a less obvious codex in terms of just certain builds that you really want to go for, as they seem stronger than anything else. I think in general we'll see quite a lot of Scarab Occult Terminators, Contemptor Dreadnoughts and Rubric Marines doing the heavy lifting, though I think normally the focus is usually going to be on a Sorcerer core, maybe with a Thousand Sons Demon Prince or 2. Again, I do feel like they might turn into one of the harder armies to play. not just as easily point and delete as some of the other armies in the game, but could be one of those armies that when mastered by a really competent opponent, will be able to exploit all of the myriad options of psychic powers within the codex. Again, I'll most certainly be interested to see if any Thousand Sons army builds truly start to become dominant. Moving on, we come to the new and reimagined greenskins, with a crazy amount of new kits and love that they're getting with their new codex. Orcs have been in a slightly weird place for a while now, with only some of the Orc players being able to get their hands on the new codex through that Beast Snagger box, and it's only just been released in full this month. That has meant that a fair few tournaments haven't been allowing the new codex yet, and that might have affected the amount of wins that they've got. Not only that, but they're still awaiting the release of several key units, including the Beast Boss on the Squigosaur and their Kill Rig, both of which seem incredibly powerful and threatening on paper. Despite being slightly limited so far, they still have one of the better win rates out of any codex, 56%, and 3 top 4 placings over the time period I was looking at. If this is Orcs being limited, then they're still seeming very, very strong indeed. People do seem to be experimenting with a fair few different Orc lists. There have been ones that have entirely spammed the new ramshackle boggies and planes, with loads of squig boggies and scrapjets, and maybe a few dackerjets thrown in for good measure. Add that to some fighty beast bosses, maybe a few squig hog riders or war bikes, then a whole bunch of cheap Orc utility units, things like commandos and storm boys, and you've got a list that's going to be comfortably able to do the mission while still scoring all the objectives. It's going to be interesting to see how they develop. Now they do have their codex released in full, and people are starting to get their hands on some of the new units, even if some of them are still waiting on another release wave. Otherwise, maybe just being nosed out by some of these ones slightly, are armies like Custodes, Demons and Harlequins, all of which had fairly solid 8th edition codexes. They were performing fairly solidly at the start of 9th, but are now truly starting to feel the codex creep. Necrons as well may certainly have the early codex syndrome. Strong at the time, but maybe just not shaping up quite as amazingly against some of the options that have been coming out. All of these guys are continuing to place well at a few big events though. They all have solid enough win rates, just maybe aren't stomping things flat quite as often as some of the others. Next, before we get into the top 2, I thought we'd focus on Space Marines individually for a second, as they just function so differently to the vast majority of other armies. They're certainly taking enough top 4 placings when you consider them as a whole, but as they are one super dex, supported by around 11 different supplements, and people tend to play Space Marines so much more commonly than a lot of the other factions, it really does depend on whether you take them as one individual army or 11 different mini-factions. In any case, if you combine all Space Marine results together, they have had 17 top 4 placings at grand tournaments since the Thousand Sons and Grey Knights books dropped. Again though, if you do take them together, their win rate is kind of mediocre really, around about 45% overall, certainly not on the same level as plenty of other armies. Overall, I'd argue that they're a solid enough army in themselves, perhaps with a similar sort of strength to armies like Sisters, Grey Knights and Orcs, and aren't in the top 2 armies in the game in my opinion. Over the past month or so, it's been quite interesting to see some of the new developments in Space Marine lists. Perhaps the most notable shift in the meta has been towards Iron Hands in quite a big way, who do appear to have put in a very, very good showing this month, with no less than 4 top 4 placings. I feel like they might be becoming one of the default shooting chapters to go for. Ultramarines did receive a fairly hefty nerf in one of the big FAQs, where their units coming in from reserve no longer count as stationary for firing heavy weapons. The Iron Hands super doctrine still works for this though, as it doesn't require them to count as remaining stationary. They simply ignore the penalty for moving with heavy weapons, so they can count as moving, still shoot to full effect, and get reroll ones to hit to boot. It arguably makes them one of the go-to chapters for quite a lot of units, in particular drop pod devastators, but also a lot of infantry with heavy weapons, and pretty much any vehicle in the Space Marine motor pool will do quite well. Almost every Iron Hands list that I've seen as well has also included their character contempt dreadnought, the one that can pack massive firepower but not be shot directly due to bodyguards or hiding behind other units. It seems a few people are trying to go down a bit of a mixed melee route with Iron Hands as well, taking a few successor chapter tactics such as Whirlwind of Rage and Born Heroes to make a very fighty Iron Hands list in the fight phase with Vanguard vets, and still harness all of that cool shooting firepower. Otherwise, the usual suspects are still doing very well. Ultramarines, Dark Angels, Deathwatch and White Scars all seem to be putting in good performances. Just with the sheer amount of powerful options spread between the codexes, I don't think Space Marines are going anywhere very fast. They can quite easily adapt to changing meta or even changing points cost within their own codex if they're rebalanced at all, as they've got such a crazy amount of options available, allowing a lot of strategies to be viable. So now we get into the top 2 armies, and I would currently argue that Admech are in second place, seeming to be fairly solidly above a lot of their competition, but also fairly solidly below the absolute best of the best. For their tournament performance, They've had 9 top 4 placings and a win rate of 58%, which is at least fairly convincingly second best. I think perhaps the reason that AdMech have fallen behind a little bit is that the nerfs that they got in their rebalancing FAQ really did mess with the previous optimal way to play them. I think before there were nerfs to the Rangers and Vanguard stratagems and Iron Striders were still core, I found it kind of hard to argue for any other AdMech builds at all, other than just mass deep striking Rangers and Vanguard with Lucius, backed up by a hefty contingent of Iron Striders just to lay down some seriously undercosted firepower with access to some crazily easy buffs. Sure, he could do plenty of other tactics, they'd be a bit different, but none of them really seemed convincingly stronger. Now Rangers and Vanguard's damage dealing stratagems were both fairly significantly toned down. They're still usable, but no longer hoover half an army off the board in a turn sort of usable. And Iron Striders are now much more a dedicated gunline unit that are still very solid, but no longer repressing other options to the extent where it's not worth considering them. Still though, that's by no means at all to say that AdMech are weak, they really aren't, and I think a strong AdMech list is going to give any other army in the game serious problems. A lot of their codex is just really efficient, and can have some nice easy buffs to hand out from their cheap supporting characters. Perhaps one of the most common builds at the moment is to take a fair amount of their Sicarian units, the Infiltrators and the Rust Stalkers, back them up with maybe some Tabaxi Sterilizers, Cerberus Raiders, and perhaps some veteran cohort Rangers and Vanguards, and you've got an absolutely crazy amount of fairly murderous infantry, all of which have 5+ invul saves, and a lot of which have 2 wounds. The veteran cohort also gives some nice options for Doctrina manipulation, where even just having 1 or 2 units being in a different Doctrina to what they should be can really lessen the downsides on the entire army when you are getting the extra protection from Bulwark or the extra damage from Protector. You can back that all up with their scary flyers, including their Fusiliers and Stratoraptors, maybe a few Iron Striders, and even some of the other vehicles are starting to see a bit more play now the balance isn't quite so heavily skewed in favour of them. Overall, I do feel that AdMech are a little bit more of an interesting army than they used to be, but still remain absolutely top tier, and certainly a scary faction to see on the other side of the table. Finally, last but not least, we come to the top of the shop, and the scarily destructive space elves of the Drukhari. It seems that at the moment the Drukhari still are reigning supreme. They've endured the nerfs to their Raiders, Drazar, and their competitive edge Succubus, and it still very much seems like they're the army that will give you the best chance of winning a grand tournament, just judging by their stats alone. They've had 17 top 4 placings at the grand tournament since Thousand Suns and Grey Knights dropped, nearly double as much as AdMech, and as much as every single Space Marine codex put together. That is pretty crazy for just how many people play Space Marines compared with the Darkkin. Their win rate really seems to be absolutely unmatched as well. 66% is well clear of the other armies, really not down much at all following their nerfs. Speaking of which, Games Workshop's FAQ to help rebalance them a little nerfed Raiders and Drazar by 10 points each, reined in their single Silius Succubus build, and killed the combo of Dark Technomancers and Liquefier guns. It does seem that all of those nerfs were kind of justified though, as basically every single one of those options is still seeing play in the competitive lists that are sweeping the meta. Raiders are still incredibly efficient as a transport with their invul save, fast movement, and good transport capacity. Drazar and Fighty Succubi see play in most lists, and even some people are still running Dark Technomancers, focusing on the other interesting auto-hitting option of the Kronos, which for some reason was left with the combo untouched. I think perhaps maybe one of the single biggest advantages of Drukhari at the moment is that they can really go both ways when they're playing a game. They can either use their sheer destructiveness to wipe the enemy off the table, or if they think that that isn't going to be achievable, then they can focus on really playing the mission and playing it incredibly well with their crazy fast move distances, and just how much they can punish an opponent who overextends by multi-charging them in combat and making them fight last. They have some crazily cheap and destructive units that can trade out for ones that have far greater strength, things like cheap 5-man squads of Incubi, Characters, Witches, and other fast movers like Helions and Scourges. Being able to advance and charge and having their enormous speed means that playing the mission is relatively easy. Things like flipping objectives for Dominate, or getting in all table quarters each turn really isn't the hardest thing to do. The majority of lists still seem to be building around triple patrols in Raiders, almost always the Witch Cult of Strife, though there seems to be a bit more flexibility in the Cabals and the Covens. Their speed, damage output and power combos just mean that Drukhari are an incredibly hard army to face right now, and I'd argue the single strongest army in Warhammer 40k. So let me know what you think down in the comments below. Are there any armies that I've overestimated or underrated? I'm always keen to hear your insights, particularly if there's anything important I might have missed. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, including plenty more discussion of the strongest armies and combos. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel quite a bit, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that down in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to check it out, feel free to take a look at the Patreon page, it's down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.